Welcome, everybody. My name is Jack Moline. I'm the president of Interfaith Alliance. Americans in general, and Interfaith Alliance in particular, affirm that religious freedom is a core value in the United States. It is, after all, the very first of the rights in the Bill of Rights. Universally, it is understood as the freedom for me to believe what I choose. Somewhat less universally, it is understood to protect the autonomy of those who believe differently than I do. This is particularly true of the religious right, who lay claim to what they insist are the Christian values that form the foundation of religious freedom. By claiming the Christian heritage of our founders as determinative, they affirm that our government and its policies should be shaped by these religious beliefs as they narrowly understand them. Christian nationalism, one of the most prominent expressions of that point of view, has become influential in American politics. The earnestness with which this approach is presented makes it even more important that we have an accurate and nuanced understanding of religious freedom, how it evolved over time, and how being educated and informed on this subject can better protect the First Amendment and, more important, protect the people of the United States who live by the First Amendment. Our guests for this webinar are Steve Waldman, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, and Professor Kristin Carpenter. Let me introduce them to you now. Steve Waldman is president and co-founder of Report for America, a national service program that places emerging journalists into local newsrooms. Mr. Waldman has served as senior advisor to the chair of the Federal Communications Commission and as editor-in-chief, president, and co-founder of BeliefNet, a multi-faith spirituality website. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Founding Faith: How Our Founding Fathers Forged a Radical New Approach to Religious Liberty, and we're going to hear about that, and is a columnist covering spirituality and politics for the Wall Street Journal Online. Dr. Corey D.B. Walker is a scholar of African American social, political, and religious thought. Corey D.B. Walker has published broadly on African American religion and philosophy, African American history and culture, as well as religion and American public life. He is visiting professor at the University of Richmond, where he teaches in the School of Arts and Sciences and the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. Dr. Walker is currently Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities. His research and teaching interests include Africana philosophy, critical theory, ethics, social and political philosophy, and religion and public life. Dr. Walker also serves as the Senior Fellow in Religious Freedom at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C., a great institution. Kristin Carpenter. Professor Carpenter is Council Tree Professor of Law and Director of the American Indian Law Program at the University of Colorado Law School. She served as a member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which it's called MRIP, which is a great name, from 2017 to 2021, and was its chair from 2019 to 2020. Professor Carpenter teaches and writes in the fields of human rights and indigenous peoples law, with emphasis on rights to land, culture, and religion. I don't expect anybody to repeat those credentials back, but I do expect you all to be impressed. So let's not hear any more from me. And Mr. Waldman, let me turn to you first. You literally wrote the book on the founding of religious freedom in the United States. It's a great read, and I don't want to discourage anybody from actually doing the reading. But I want to ask you to begin with the end. What is your premise about America's founding faith?
Well, I have a confession, which is a few years after I finished that book, I concluded there was something really big that I got wrong, which was that I focused on the founding fathers and the original concepts of religious freedom, but really came to conclude that real religious freedom didn't occur until there were another 200 years of struggle to define and elaborate on what it meant. So I wrote another book called Sacred Liberty, which was basically about the period from the founding to current day. So it really is a lot like other freedoms that we aspire to in this country, which is that the initial principles were indeed laid out, in that constitutional period, but it took decades, if not centuries, of struggle, mostly by people saying, hey, those lofty principles you got there, those aren't being actually practiced in the real world. We need to make those come to life. Now, the concept, the thing that was really revolutionary, and I sort of almost would claim this is one of America's greatest inventions, the American style of religious liberty, is that the best way to promote religion is to leave it alone. That was really kind of the insight that Madison had. He was very much a strong supporter of religion. They all thought religious vibrancy was important to the success of a republic. And we take it for granted now, but for the previous several thousand years in pretty much every other society in the world, the solution was, if you thought religion was important, you'd have the state promote it. You'd have the state get behind it. And Madison and others' insight was not that we want a secular society. They didn't want a secular society, but that a healthy, vibrant, and free religious society meant keeping the government from picking winners and losers and having their thumb on the scale. As I said, it took a long, long time before these concepts became real for many people, and even to this day, there are still in the U.S. pockets where it's not true. But at this point, I would say religious liberty has come so far from the original, in a good way, that it is something, despite its problems, that we can be proud of.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Walker, the enslaved people who were brought to America did not arrive as Baptists and African Methodist Episcopalians. What can you say about the right to religious freedom as it applied to them in the early days of the Republic?
Thanks, Jack, for your question. And I think where Steve began really highlights the limitations of the view of religious freedom, even at its founding. And those limitations were not external to it. I mean, those limitations were internal and constitutive of the ideal predicated on notions of equality and autonomy, were circumscribed by the very nature of how equality and autonomy were developed around a conception of the human to which enslaved Africans were not admitted. We also have to add that the very idea of religion as an organized system of beliefs that can be recognized through a particular regime of rationality was limited to the European sphere and cultures within Europe, such that those beliefs, customs, habits, ways of thinking, and ideas of inaugurating one's position within a broad realm of the universe was not part and parcel of those individuals who were not deemed part of the human enterprise. So, of course, Native American beliefs and African enslaved Africans were not within that realm. And so we have a constitutive ideal that is at its foundation very limited. And in that limitation, what you have is an antagonistic and agonistic struggle around what would constitute religious freedom, indeed what would constitute the realm of freedom in a modern polity and in a modern state. We also have to recognize that the idea of religious freedom is bound up with a conception of the modern citizen that is deeply connected to a very Christocentric idea of the nation state and its proper governing apparatus, such that the languages, ideas, and frameworks of citizenship and the frameworks of freedom are inevitably bound up and inevitably poach those dominant Christian ideas and ideals that then translate over into the political sphere. So we have centuries of struggle around what constitutes them. In many ways, I like to think that religious liberty is less an ideal set out by the founders. Rather, religious liberty is an organic concept that continues to morph and change around the habits, customs, and traditions and commitments of a particular polity across space and time. So although we may want to draw a linear line or a teleological line between the articulation of a concept in the 18th century and then see its full flowering in our moment, I think it would be better for us conceptually to begin to look at the ways in which religious liberty has transformed and changed across space and time as those foundational ideals of equality, autonomy, and the ideal of what it means to be human have shaped and changed across space and time.
It sounds to me almost like you're saying that in order to enjoy whatever blessings there were of religious liberty, the African population that came to the United States had to adopt the religion that was being protected by that First Amendment.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say that the ways in which enslaved Africans adopt and change religions of Europe, of Africa, and also indigenous religions. Remember, the U.S. becomes this space in which indigenous peoples in the Americas, of course, indigenous Africans, as well as transplanted Europeans come together and create these New World cultures. They began to develop a new conception of what it means to have a religion and new conceptions of freedom, such that now we begin to have to mobilize how they are beginning to articulate those new conceptions, and also impinge on those dominant frameworks that wanted to impose a singular conception of religious freedom. Remember, religious freedom in the 18th century cannot recognize indigenous religions, nor can it recognize African religions. That has to come as we begin to expand the very frameworks of religion itself and the very framework of freedom. All too often, our conversations want to make religious freedom expansive instead of how their fundamental structures have been foundationally transformed. So, Jack, I want to twist it a little bit to see how we can begin to shift and change that framework. And even as we're wrestling with in our contemporary moment, we have those forces that are trying to marshal a religious nostalgia that has this singular, dominant, hegemonic meaning and hegemonic formation around religious freedom that will then tether it to a singular conception of the nation, a singular conception of the citizen, and a singular conception of the human.
Well, thank you. That gives me an opportunity to turn to Professor Carpenter with a similar concern. And I know you're having a little internet trouble, but we'll lean in. Professor Carpenter, the indigenous nations of North America had rich and historically deep religious legacies long before anybody else got here. Were their native beliefs and practices protected even in theory in the early days of the Republic, as you see it?
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for your patience with my connectivity. I'm pleased to be here with you. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it is the case that American Indian religious freedoms are still not protected to this very day. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But going back to the arrival of Europeans and others on what is now North America and the United States, indigenous peoples did have, and in fact continue to have, hundreds of different religious traditions, as we would now call them. Of course, they were all in their own languages. And so the word religion was not used, but a connection with a creator, a sense of ritual, of beliefs, of practices that bound them and continue to bind them as a community. And today there are ongoing practices to renew the world, to cleanse people, to keep the earth in balance with human beings. And it was the case, for our founding fathers and a number of the early cases from the US Supreme Court that American Indians were thought to be savage, infidel, pagan. And in fact, because they were non-Christian, I think that's what those terminologies were trying to assert. The fact of their non-Christianity was used as a basis for depriving them of their land. The doctrine of discovery was applied came from the Pope and then was brought here into federal law in cases like Johnson versus McIntosh to justify the dispossession of land. There's so much more I could say, but I guess I'd like to make two more points. In the early days of the United States in the 17, 18, but even 1900s, most American Indian religions were prohibited by federal law. Feasts, ceremonies, the practices of medicine men, the use of religious sacraments were all affirmatively outlawed. People were put in prison, they were denied rations, they were even killed. In the case of Wounded Knee, when the 7th Cavalry killed 200 Lakota people while they prayed, literally 4 days after Christmas. And those laws and programs only stopped in 1978, after I was born, when Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, finally declaring it to be federal policy to respect American Indian religions, but not while people aren't being actively shot down while they pray. It is still the case that the Supreme Court does not recognize American Indians as entitled to the protections of the First Amendment. In the 1988 case of Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association, Justice O'Connor held for the court, for the majority, that the federal government could destroy an American Indian sacred site in California, even if it would virtually destroy the religion. In 1990, in the infamous Smith case, Justice Scalia wrote that it was fine for a state to prohibit American Indian sacramental practices, the ingestion of peyote. For the most part, although Smith has been slightly retracted by RFRA, those are still good law. And in fact, a federal district court in Arizona just applied Ling a couple of months ago to uphold the right of the Forest Service to trade to a multinational mining company an Apache sacred site, which will be completely demolished, and with it, the coming of age ceremonies of Apache young women. There is no religious freedom for American Indians in the United States in 2021.
Thank you. So we know already that we're dealing with a nostalgic concept that doesn't necessarily match, that certainly doesn't match the reality of what we have on the ground. And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation. Let's talk about it theoretically for just a second. Mr. Waldman, generations of colonists lived here before the ratification of the Constitution. Was religious freedom a new idea that arose with formal independence from England, or did it land here with the Europeans who arrived more than a century before? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. To oversimplify, I think the period before the Constitution was a couple hundred years of colonies trying different approaches to religious freedom that mostly failed. And they were approaches that don't, for the most part, resemble what we talk about even aspirationally as religious freedom. They were often, religious freedom for a particular religion, but not for the others. And I think that what was really especially influential on the Madison and their generation was not even so much the ideas of imported from Europe, but the persecution that was happening in their own backyard. In the case of Virginia, of Baptists. Baptists were being thrown in jail for the crime of being Baptists in Virginia, down the road from Madison's house and from, where these folks lived. So they didn't need to learn about this by reading John Locke or reading about religious wars in Europe. they were seeing the consequences firsthand of religious persecution in their backyards. And this is part of the issue that when you really look at the full sweep, the deprivations of religious liberty have been the norm, not the exception throughout American history. The two worst cases are the ones we've talked about already, the absolute kind of total deprivations that were involved with slavery and the approach to Native Americans, both in terms of the banning of religions that Professor Carpenter has talked about, and also the massive attempt to kind of force Christianity on Native American children through the schooling system. But in addition to that, at the point that the Declaration of Independence was signed, I think it was 7 of the 11 colonies banned Catholics and Jews. And it wasn't even really the case that it was religious freedom for Christians back then. It was religious freedom for Protestants. Actually, that's not even true. It was religious freedom for 2 denominations of Protestants, Congregationalists and Episcopalians. So who the religious freedom was for was quite, was very, very narrow, and who the other was kept changing. Like initially, the other was everyone other than Episcopalians and Congregationalists, and then it grew a little broader to be Protestants, and then but for another 100 years, Catholics were basically written out of religious freedom and fought to have that. And over time, it has gotten better and better. And there have been more and more different groups have been included into the definition of religious freedom, but it's only been through real blood and struggle, and and we're not there yet. But the concept of religious freedom, I think they took a pretty hard turn when they wrote the First Amendment. That was a real departure from what had happened in the previous 200 years in the colonies. And some of that certainly was influenced by European thinking. It is true that Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, had elements of religious freedom that were important. But I tend to think that is somewhat overstated compared to the searing experience of what they were seeing in the persecution of primarily in that case of Baptists and Catholics and Quakers that really led them to the approach that they adopted in the First Amendment.
There we go. I imagine, Dr. Walker, that there is no community in the United States that has had more of a public confrontation with Christian nationalism, let's even call it white Christian nationalism, than the Black community. Are there analogs or antecedents to Christian nationalism that exist in African American faith? And if so, are there lessons we can learn from its expression?
Well, I think the question that you're posing really presupposes a certain conflict of sovereignties. There are conflict of sovereignties of a religious nature, those conflicts of ultimate claims and commitments that individuals are committed to, informed by culture, history, tradition, heritage, and sovereignty of the state, and particularly of the modern state, that presupposes that this modern state can host a pluralistic panoply of all of these competing claims and commitments, and can adequately adjudicate between the commitments of competing groups. What it doesn't presuppose, and here's the problematic at the root of it, is that the sovereignty of the state smuggles in a unique and singular conception of what circumscribes citizenship, how those claims, responsibilities, and those rights of the citizen are then expressed, and the ways in which they're predicated on a notion of what it means to be human in the world. So over time, what we've seen is the ways in which that has always been challenged. African Americans, of course, through the Black freedom struggle, the long Black freedom struggle from beginning in the 1400s and 1500s, enslaved Africans in the Americas are beginning to strain against those dominant ideas of what it means to be human and what it means to be a citizen in these polities, to begin to exercise different understandings of freedom up through our modern moment, the ideals that we want to invoke around, of course, Martin Luther King, the Black freedom struggle, Ella Baker, and so forth. What we yet to begin to engage in is how these freedom struggles fundamentally challenge those dominant ideas that govern and constrain our senses of freedom, particularly religious freedom, and our sense of how the nation can operate. What does it mean to be a modern nation made up and comprised of all of these different varieties of individuals with all of these different competing claims and commitments that are deeply rooted, not only into culture, heritage, and not only rooted in culture, but also heritage, tradition, and worldviews. That becomes the challenge. So it's not easy to just marshal up a nostalgic remembering of the past and then deploy it in our present. Instead, it causes us to begin to question, what are the conditions of possibility, if you will, for the expression of a religious freedom in light of all that we know now, in light of the competing issues that are confronting our polity in our contemporary world? What resources can be marshaled and mobilized to begin to develop a broader, more capacious notion of religious freedom in our moment? How can we then actualize a broader discourse of religious freedom that enables us to reach our highest aspirations and aims as a pluralistic polity? It may mean that in this moment, what is needed is not so much a preordained conclusion or end to the conversation, but an actual opening of the discourse of religious freedom, such that we can ask new questions, realize that the ideas of religious freedom that are at root, those ideas of equality and autonomy, and those ideas of what it means to be human, are deeply contested, and that we need new questions to open up the imaginary of new possibilities of religious freedom in our contemporary moment. That may be an opening, and it only is just that, an opening. No guarantees are involved, but I think it provides us with a richer, more contextual manner in which we can begin to develop and evolve a notion of religious freedom that can actually host all of these competing issues and pressures that we're facing in our moment.
It's fascinating. And I thank you for raising the issue of a pluralistic approach to all of this, because Professor Carpenter, that's where I want to go with you. My guess is that most Americans who are not of indigenous heritage have very little idea about the so-called religious beliefs and practices of the original nations. Was there a sense of religious pluralism among the nations? And did this constitutional principle therefore resonate or trouble the native population?
I thank you for the question, and I appreciated Dr. Walker's opening up of the discussion around pluralism. My sense is that for American Indians and for Indigenous peoples broadly, a worldview that is capacious enough for pluralistic experiences, it is very intuitive for them. And so when you look in the United States, what's now the United States, at most sacred sites, for example, there was tremendous litigation around the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona a number of years ago, when the Forest Service decided to allow snowmaking on the ski area in the desert that is sacred to 12 tribes in the Southwest. So Navajo, Hopi, Havasupai, Apache, and a number of others. And I think what's telling about that case and so many others, Bear Lodge, the High Country, and so on, is that it's usually a number of tribes that will bring their own beliefs and understandings, their own names for sacred sites, particular rituals, particular belief systems and practices, and they can share reverence for a single site, but they may use it at different times of the year. They may have different standards of stewardship, but they have historically been able to accommodate one another. Across language differences and ritual differences and so on. And so I think that pluralism, is absolutely intuitive to Indigenous peoples. I think, in fact, they were very generous in many of their first encounters with Europeans and others, understanding that they had a different belief system, but their worldviews could tolerate that people could be spiritual, that they could connect with a creator in a way that didn't involve hegemony or oppression or domination. And I think, one point that perhaps I'd like to inject into the conversation at this point is that the human rights movement, the international human rights movement, envisions religious freedom in this regard. We haven't been able to do it in the United States. But for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which grew out of the Holocaust and the atrocities and massacres of 6 million Jews and others, was meant to establish a way for the world community, comprised of so many different religions, to live in peace and harmony, without genocide, without war, and so on. And I think it absolutely inscribes and comes from a tradition of pluralism. The Universal Declaration provides that people have not only a right to belief, which was what we have in the United States, this teeny little core set of beliefs that we can do at home privately, but also a right to practice. We have a right to do so in private and in public under the Universal Declaration. And there have been further declarations, like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that contextualizes those basic universal human rights. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about these matters I've been discussing: the right to practice one's religion at a sacred site on the landscape, or the right to use a plant as a sacrament instead of a plant that's been turned into wine. And so I think that there are absolutely models out there, but as with many things, the United States is resistant to looking beyond its own borders to find them.
Well, I think what we want to do now is take all of these terrific ideas and turn a little bit to one of the concerns that we as Interfaith Alliance has been focused on, and that is Christian nationalism and the attempt in this country to sort of roll things back to where they were, as we've discussed at the beginning of our national endeavor in these areas. Dr. Walker, though Black people in America are well represented in every faith community, the predominantly Black Christian denominations have a powerful and dominant legacy that is very public and often very political. Would you talk about how the notion of religious freedom in the Black community encounters the notion of Christian nationalism?
Well, Jack, I appreciate that question. And I think what we're seeing now expressed in our public realm, the expression of a white supremacist Christian nationalism, is what we've witnessed over the last 50 to 60 years with the burgeoning of the modern Black freedom movement and the mobilization of a Black prophetic faith in the public sphere to begin to fundamentally transform the parameters of American democracy. So what you saw at the earliest of the Black freedom movement was a counter mobilization, a wedding of the idea of what it means not only to be a Christian, but what it means to be a white citizen and what it means to be an American. So when you're looking at this post-World War II moment that Christian reminds us so powerfully of, that we have this explosion of possibility of human community and of the reaffirmation of human dignity coming out of the Holocaust, coming out of the experience of World War II. You also have the mobilization and the wedding of a singular identity of God, nation, citizen, and race. And we see that so clearly in the 1950s and 1960s. The white citizens councils aren't just white citizens councils operating around the idea of what the nation state should be. It is operating and it's authorizing what the nation state should be, because the nation state, it is inevitably guaranteed, ordained, and authorized by God. And God's emissaries, a Christian God, are these white citizens who have brought civilization to the Americas. So it's mobilizing a historic narrative that then draws its contemporary force within the modern nation state to enforce that hegemony. And as those regimes of white supremacy are challenged, and as democracy is being reconstructed by the Black freedom movement, and of course its gains in that moment, you're also seeing the counter mobilization. Individuals developing religious academies predicated on the notion of what? Religious freedom. The mobilization and then the consecration of reproductive rights, or restriction of reproductive rights, becoming an ideal in the late 70s that is inaugurated and developed and becomes central to a particular political identity whose goal is to take back America for God and for God's citizens. And of course, as it captures the White House with Reagan and has continued to mobilize with the religious right throughout the past 40 years, and with a culmination in Trump, you see its wedding of state power and religious power coming together, particularly around judiciary and around law. And what we have with African-American public faith is sort of a counter presence, a counter language and vocabulary to begin to marshal and mobilize against these forces. But what we have yet to do is to realize that the languages and concepts and vocabularies of African-American mobilization counter to these movements to restrict democracy are fundamentally about redefining and reconstructing the very parameters of democracy itself, the very parameters of what it means to be a citizen, and the very parameters of what it means to be human. All too often, we think that the lessons and resources that the Black freedom struggle offers us is one in which we can fulfill an already preordained future for what America is, instead of beginning to understand that America can be fundamentally reconstructed, redefined, and our goals and values and ideals are ever evolving because of the changing nature of the polity. The challenge of Christian nationalism, of white supremacist Christian nationalism, and notice, Jack, I added supremacist because that's important. It's just not, identity in and of itself. This is really about questions of political power and how to mobilize it. The real danger of white supremacist Christian nationalism in this moment is not only the exaltation of a particular theocentric conception of the nation, it is the singular conception of what it means to be human, what it means to be citizen, and what it means to be modern in the world. That's the true challenge. It's those core concepts that seemingly are off the table that the Black public faith brings on the table because they have yet to be defined in a manner that can affirm a vision of democracy that is broader and expansive than even what the founders could have imagined.
I appreciate your framing that in this political and American cultural context. Professor Carpenter, if I can turn to you for an observation parallel to that on a more, I'll call it elemental level. You have an expertise on human rights with an emphasis on land, culture, and religion. How's the promise of the Constitution been realized or betrayed in those contexts here in the United States?
Thank you, Rabbi. And your questions are causing me to lose my natural optimism, but I have to report faithfully. I mean, the Constitution has been, in my context, applied in the breach. I mean, American Indians don't have religious freedom rights under the First Amendment. They don't have property rights under the Fifth Amendment. They've often been denied voting rights. I mean, I could go through the list. And I think that the comments about the confluence of sovereignty, nationalism, citizenship, who belongs and who's excluded, is very resonant in the American Indian context. It's very poignant for Indigenous peoples to have, inhabited this land and then to have been excluded from the settler colonial experiment that brought these institutions to stay, and did so by displacing Indigenous peoples from the governing body, moving them to the far edges of their own landscapes, and then taking those lands altogether. I would like to see the Constitution at least live up to its internal norms and values vis-a-vis equality, for example. And so, without going too far down the property law realm, which is my other area of expertise, I'll just say that Aboriginal title, that is lands that Indigenous people hold under their own laws, customs, and traditions that predated the arrival of anybody else in this continent. In many countries today, those Indigenous laws, customs, and traditions are recognized as a basis for cognizable property rights. That is still not the case in the United States. So a tribe, whether in Alaska or California, there's a current case in New Mexico that continues to hold its land under its original land tenure, still does not have a case under the Fifth Amendment in the United States. This is clearly a breach of equality, which most other countries to consider this issue have recognized. And it also goes precisely to the issues that we're talking about, given how interwoven Indigenous peoples' religions are with their lands. Most Indigenous peoples have a single site of creation, a migration story, places where rituals can only uniquely be practiced today. If they can't protect those lands or access them, they don't have religious freedom. So the deprivation of property goes hand in hand with the deprivation of religion. And so far, again, I'd like to be optimistic, but our courts are not still interpreting the Constitution in a way that would recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples in those contexts.
I hope I give you a moment to be optimistic before we conclude the webinar. Mr. Waldman, I want to pose one more question to you. The argument is made by Christian nationalists that Christian nationalists are simply seeking to exercise the same rights guaranteed to others by the First Amendment. Is that correct? And if it isn't, what do we do about it?
No, I'd say, almost the definition of Christian nationalism, as opposed to other forms of conservatism, is that they don't embrace religious pluralism. And I think that there's a difference of perspective, but on the kind of right of center world here. there is a conservative strain that's represented, by the conservatives on the current Supreme Court that are actually taking things like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and some of the forms of progress that were won by religious minorities. They're using that case law to argue for rights for themselves, for Christian Americans as what are now minorities. That there's vexing issues with that, but there is a kind of internal consistency to it. They're basically saying, hey, those religious freedoms that you all got for yourself, you minorities, we want that now. And that's one debate. Christian nationalists, that's not really what they're arguing. They're arguing that there is a sort of, that America is a Christian nation. It is inherently a Christian nation. It was foundationally a Christian nation, and that superiority should be recognized and baked into it. Whereas the other group of conservatives are not making that argument. They're making more of a defensive argument about the religious rights that have been built up for other religious minorities should now be applied to us. And then you have all these, debates over, well, what does that mean? And they would say, well, that means the freedom to not bake a cake for, a same-sex couple. But those are really, within that conservative world, those are two different approaches. And I think it's important that we recognize that Christian nationalism, as I understand it, do not fundamentally embrace religious pluralism as a goal, even superficially. That their argument is something much more like the argument that existed, certainly was a uniform argument prior to the Constitution, but existed along the way, many times, that this is a Christian nation, that Christianity, and what they really mean is certain types of Christianity, should have a primacy and a higher value than other religions.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in from people who are viewing this webinar. Professor Carpenter, I want to start with this question that came in. As our demographics change, how do you see the challenges and promise of religious freedom evolving? Are you hopeful or pessimistic? Here's your chance to be optimistic if you want to be.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a good launching pad for optimism. And I think that representation does matter. The demographics of the country are changing, and we see those having tangible results in terms of our elected and appointed officials. I think having a mixed race woman as the vice president, as well as having, in our context, an enrolled tribal member as the Secretary of the Interior, Deborah Haaland, his Laguna Pueblo, really does offer the potential for change in the political landscape with respect to religion. And I was glad that Mr. Waldman brought up the very tragic federal Indian boarding schools in which Indigenous children were removed from their families and required to learn English, Christianity, and manual labor, lessons that were enforced through violence. And it's now becoming apparent that hundreds, probably thousands of them were killed, and their mass graves are being just now discovered on the former premises of those schools throughout the United States. This is not a hopeful note, but what is a hopeful note is that Secretary Deborah Haaland, whose own family history reflects this experience, has called for an investigation. And I think having people in those positions, people who are people of color, who've experienced oppression, portends accountability in the United States in a way that we have never really had before. So I'm hoping that through some of that representation, voice, accountability, we can move toward truth, perhaps healing. Might not happen in my lifetime, but perhaps I can be hopeful for my children.
Mr. Waldman, you look like you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, there's, you could make the case that the most important piece of legislation affecting religious freedom in the last 100 years was not a religious freedom bill. It was the Immigration Act of 1965, because that, in effect, led to a massive immigration of non-Christian people into the United States, the top countries being India, China, Korea, Vietnam, from those decades after. And it forced a reckoning, and is continuing to force the reckoning, that pluralism doesn't mean pluralism within Christianity. That pluralism means pluralism in the very broadest sense of the word. Up until that point, there was, often you would have people talk about pluralism. There's some amazing passages in the context of the persecution of Native Americans where the authorities in the Interior Department would say, we believe in religious freedom. And what they meant by that was not actually religious freedom for Native Americans. They meant the freedom for Native Americans to choose either Protestantism or Catholicism. That's what they meant by religious freedom, not that they could, keep practicing their own faith. And so for 150, almost 200 years, even the concept of pluralism kind of meant pluralism within Christianity. And then after World War II, it meant Judeo-Christian. What the Immigration Act did is brought millions and millions more of Muslims and Buddhists and other non-Judeo-Christian faiths, and has forced a sort of reckoning about broadening the notion of pluralism.
I'm glad that you raised the issue of legislation. And Dr. Walker, I want to turn to you with a question, but you want to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I want to amplify what Kristen and Steve really draw our attention to, that the ways in which we understand religious freedom is solely pertaining to a notion of religion, that we've an a priori notion of religion, even if it's Abrahamic, or even if it recognizes other traditions out of the Abrahamic tradition, is really narrow in scale and scope, given the deep plurality within the American polity that does not enable us to develop a sort of neat, contained, and boundaried notion of what religious freedom is. Instead, what we're having is a conceptual problem, because we can't conceive that religious freedom impinges on questions of environment, economy, political ecology, the ways in which we think about meaning in the world, and the ways in which we think about being human in the world. So what we're also seeing is that pressure, and this comes right out of really, that post 1950s moment, that we no longer have, or if there's ever been, we're no longer in a moment where we can have a neat, clean, boundary notion of what religious freedom is. And what the struggle is of course, trying to develop that and deploy it and reinforce it in the politics of our law and the politics of statecraft. But also, there's always the ever-present, and where we can always find hope, the political practices of people that are constantly exploding these neat and clean divides that we would love to have and that we create, but they remind us that they're never enough and they're insufficient to the phenomena that we're trying to wrestle with. And so the people are constantly forging us to develop new ideas and new ways and new expressions of religious freedom. And that's a good thing.
So I'm impressed not only by your insight, but through your prescience through this whole conversation to anticipate what I'm going to ask next. We have another question from a listener wanting to know what you consider to be the promises and limitations of advancing religious freedom for all through legal and legislative strategies. Dr. Walker.
Well, we gotta, and Kristen will be, she's the expert on this, and what I'll do is offer a framing of it. What we see in contemporary case law, even the arguments last night coming out of the dissent of the three justices, is a framing effect. And what law enables us to, what law does and legal culture enables, what it facilitates is a framing effect of how we think about, conceive, and then deploy publicly notions around religious freedom. What we also must have, and this is what this program does and the work of others in and around religious freedom. I'm thinking of the folks at the BJC in DC, folks at Reimagining Religious Freedom, particularly the work of Sabrina Dent and others. What we see is there's also a public discourse pressuring us to then develop new conceptions of religious freedom, to reimagine it from the ground up, that can then serve as a framing force that can be mobilized in multiple discursive contexts, such that the framing effect of law, of the ways in which courts rule, the ways in which we develop particular public policy prescriptives, then do not become the only or the dominant way in which we think about religious freedom. All too often, and this is some of the scholarship of folks like Samuel Moyne at Yale, and of course, Stephen Smith at Yale, really challenge us in that regard to begin to sort of decenter or think of in a counter manner, that not as in its inevitable challenge, but more importantly, the ways in which it channels how we understand religious freedom, and actually attenuates and diminishes the ways in which we understand religious freedom. We need more capacious ideas of religious freedom. This conversation goes to that. Legal culture is but one venue. It is not the totality of it. And the conversation around religious freedom suffers when it actually is telescoped to one regime, recognizing that the legal regime holds particular political power in our contemporary moment.
We are very near the end of our time. Professor Carpenter, I'd love to give you a very brief shot at that question as well.
Well, the time is now. I mean, the Supreme Court has the opportunity to revisit employment division versus Smith. It keeps coming up. That was the case that really severely limited previous free exercise clause jurisprudence. And I think the justices who are themselves conservative Christians, who many of them were appointed by a white nationalist regime, have the opportunity to transcend all of the limits, racism, and oppression of that background and do the right thing here. They have the opportunity to recognize that the First Amendment applies to all people in the United States. We saw Justice Barrett kind of struggling, well, what would the new model be if we abandoned Smith? The model would be what I think Mr. Waldman and Dr. Walker are talking about. It would be a constitution that can be applied to allow for multiple means of worship and spiritual life in this country.
Thank you. We've been very honored to bring this discussion among three thought leaders in the field of the origins and expressions of religious freedom. Professor Kristin Carpenter, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, and Mr. Steve Waldman. I want to thank you for joining us and engaging with each other and with only two of the questions of the many we had from our audience. This webinar is produced by Interfaith Alliance, Protecting Your Faith and Freedom. It was planned and produced by Maureen O'Leary and Emily Hauser, who is that big orange E on your screen. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org, where you can sign up for more information from us, and if you so choose, donate to the cause. I'm Jack Moline, President of Interfaith Alliance. Thank you for joining us today.